It was really a very interesting and I think unpredictable hour in terms of how much news the president was going to break. I mean, we're all watching for the president's performance here, but he did also break some news just on the issue of domestic politics, talking about saying the delegates to the Democratic Convention are free to vote their conscience, describing that, answering that in such a way as if that's obvious. That's not necessarily a thing that is obvious. Also, the president laying down at the very end of his remarks there a sort of predicate for what it would take for him to leave the race. He said he would leave the race if his advisors came to him and showed him the data that said there was, quote, no way you can win, meaning no way that he, President Biden, could win. He then also said emphatically that no poll says that. But he's essentially establishing that as the threshold that would need to be crossed if he was going to leave. So, and I won't go on at length. I will just say, though, you noted that there were some moments of, startlingly impressive command of the issues. This is just my opinion. He is not only strong on foreign policy, he is just fundamentally right on foreign policy in the way that he talks about it. And again, your mileage may vary. That is how I feel about the way he talks about our relationship with our allies and our relationship with NATO. You can hear his command of the issues, particularly in his asides, like mentioning as an offhand way that it was Turkey really that needed really to be talked into an expansion of NATO that included Finland and Sweden, talking about the numbers of Russian troop losses in Ukraine, talking about the fact that he turned in his notes after he spoke privately with President Xi, alluding to the fact that Trump had all those weird meetings with the Russians and Putin in which he'd had no note taker present. I mean, it's even in the little asides where it just shows you he is a master of the foreign policy field and has been for decades in his career in the Senate, the vice president, and the presidency. And yet he undercuts his own presentation of those facts simply in the way that he presents them, with his self-interrupting and elliptical style, the very soft-spoken monotone that he sometimes uses. There's a big mismatch between his stylistic presentation and his truly masterful command of the subject matter on the subject that was the main focus of this presser, which was foreign policy.
That's, I think, incredibly well said. I would also note on foreign policy, he also got a question about Israel, a very long answer that was interesting, and I think measured in ways that some of his previous statements on that conflict haven't quite been. He also said, it's time for this war to end. I mean, that statement, which also struck me as news. It's time for this war to end, I believe, was the sentence that he uttered. Let me go to you, Joy, for your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways this was a classic Biden. Foreign policy is his bailiwick. He was, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. As he mentioned, this is his strong point. And I think the parts where the press conference went into foreign policy and became rather sort of a mundane press conference, this was not like strictly the White House press corps. So it gave President Biden an opportunity to be normal. A lot of this struck me as just very normal. And I think that is something that he needed. This was President Biden as the longtime policy wonk. He gave himself credit for getting 50 nations to agree to expand NATO. He was very, there was a lot of sort of self-praise of his own foreign policy, which I think is important. He touted his victories. He had a really passionate moment at the end where he talked about the fact we need to control guns, not girls. And he got really passionate about more children being killed by a bullet than any place on earth in the United States of America. So he showed some passion there. I think, the gaffes and mixing up names, I think for people who've been observing Joe Biden for a really long time, that's actually just normal Biden. Like, he does mix up names. Was known for gaffes. This is the joke that was always about Joe Biden, is that he's the gaffe guy. So I don't know that that is necessarily going to harm him in some special way. It's the fact that he had the energy, the capacity, and the ability to be normal Joe Biden, if a little more hoarse, if a little bit more, obviously older, just an older version of the Biden that we've sort of gotten used to over the years. It was the abnormality of the Biden in the debate with Donald Trump that threw people off so much. But I will close just by saying the guy that we just saw for the last hour is definitely not someone who is considering leaving the race. He cited the polls showing that there's no data that he's seen that says that he can't win. He was very praiseworthy of Kamala Harris, of Vice President Harris, as he should be, and said some really warm and good things about her. But he also said, even though that he believes that she is clearly qualified to be president, and that's why he chose her, even if someone showed him data that showed that she did better than him, unless he sees data that he can't win, this doesn't sound like a man that's thinking about getting out.
That's a great point. I thought it was an excellent question, actually, by that the last reporter there with that counterfactual. I thought it was a really interesting question and straightforward and well delivered. I thought, actually, the questions generally were quite good. Nicole, your thoughts after watching that?
Well, I think the reporter who asked the second question about the president mixing up Vladimir Putin and President Zelensky went right at what this is really about, right? Are you in decline, was his answer. And I thought it was a good moment for the journalists for having the courage to, those rooms can be intimidating. And it was a good moment for the president to take that on and give his answer. And again, it's not up to us, it's up to the voters and it's up to the Democrats whether or not they accept that answer. I think that this is another split screen moment. I mean, my understanding is that tomorrow a political dam is likely to break. CBS News is reporting tonight that 40 Democrats are likely to break with President Joe Biden tomorrow. There's a report in ABC News that people who were at the Juneteenth event report seeing the Joe Biden that the world saw at the debate, an echo to the George Clooney letter from yesterday. I think we were reminded of all of this president's strengths. I think that the room disappeared when David Sanger of the New York Times asked this president about China, and you got the impression he would have stood there and talked to David Sanger for 45 more minutes. He wasn't in a hurry. He wasn't defensive. The tough questions in some ways served him better than anything else in the room. But I think that the other train is in motion. And I think, you know, two things on the politics. There's no incumbent president with lower approval ratings who won. There are only 3 with lower approval ratings than he has right now, and they all lost. Donald Trump, George H.W. Bush, and Jimmy Carter. So some of the political information is what worries some folks in his inner circle. And there is right now no poll that shows him winning.
Yeah, I think that's all well said. I mean, the political calculations, I thought, you know, him saying that I would drop out if they said there's no way he could win, and no poll shows that. Of course, no single poll could show that, right? So this is fundamentally him saying that is, to me, puts his finger on what has made this so difficult and so anguishing for so many people, which is that we just don't know the future. No one does. And no one gets to say, if you do this thing definitively, then this will follow, because that's not the way it works. There was something he said that I thought was very striking, where he talked about, and I thought this was honest, and I think it actually gives a window in the psychology. He says, I've got to finish the job. And he said that emphatically. And I've been comparing him to a World Series starter in the 7th game of the World Series who's got 4 outs left to get in a close game and has thrown 120 pitches. And when the manager comes out to the mound, they never want to go. They're never like, yes, take me out, ever. They curse into their glove. They go like this to the manager. They fight it. That, to me, I have to finish the job, Rachel, was an honest articulation of where all this motivation is coming from, even if he's not correct about his own political prospects or in denial about the inexorable trajectory of being a human being who is mortal, like we all are.
Yeah.
That was, to me, clarifying.
And, you know, you make a really important point, Chris, that I think we can't say frequently enough as Democrats and people who want Donald Trump to be prevented from returning to the White House sort of anguish over this decision, which is that there is not perfect information about the future. And the argument that President Biden is best positioned to beat Donald Trump is an argument. There are other arguments that are also data-based that other people might have a better shot at it. I think that what Nicole points out about the reality about polling numbers for incumbent presidents and the real history of that versus what President Biden said, which was not actually factually accurate as far as I can tell. That's worrying, because it makes me worry that the president is being given information about his political standing that may not be based in reality, that may be sunnier than is real. But I also think the president spoke from a factually grounded place throughout his entire remarks. And again, importantly, at the end, what did he say when he got that very sharp question? That's the very closing question from the entire presser, when he was asked what he would need to hear to make him decide that the right thing to do for the country would be to leave. He did say in his answer to that, there are other Democrats who can beat Trump, too. He said, I believe I am best qualified to govern. I believe I am best positioned, best qualified to beat him. There are other Democrats who could beat him, too. And as you said, the reason I would get out is if the data told me, the data showed that I was not going to be able to beat him. Well, no data will ever show that definitively. But him acknowledging that it's not only him who could beat Trump is an important sort of message from the reality-based world.
Yes, there has been a picture of him in this kind of bunker with his staff and a kind of mutually assured destruction, right? We're like, it's me or we're all going down together. Burn the boats is the sort of cliche I was thinking about, which is like there's no retreat, right? That was not his position tonight. He clearly intends on staying in the race, believes he is the best person to be president and to beat Trump, but did not offer the kinds of categorical dismissals of Kamala Harris or other efforts against him that I thought were possible and seemed to be present in the reporting as well. I should note that Jim Himes, who's the ranking member on intelligence, has come out with a statement saying he still believes the president needs to step down as the nominee for the Democratic Party. And I think one of the things we'll see in the fallout of this is it's almost impossible, I think, at this point, short of I don't know, running a 400-meter, that you're going to say to the people that think that you don't have a path to reassure them with press conferences, interviews, and the like. And to Nicole's point, I think we're likely to see more of that. Is there one more thing you want to say, Rachel?
There is just, I just wanted to add one other point there, which is, I think, it's critical on exactly that point you were making, which is that the president is losing the race right now. The polls don't show him winning. And that's consistent. It's not one poll. And he said, who believes the polls are right? And he has defied the polls in the past, and the Democrats defied the polls under his leadership in 2022 with the midterms, sure. But if the polls broadly, for the entire duration of this race, have broadly been accurate, he is losing. And so the thing that people need to hear in order to know that he can beat Donald Trump is how he's going to turn those polls around, what he's going to change in the campaign, what is going to change so that the current status quo, which is him losing, is not going to be the outcome. And there was no articulation of that. The closest he got to that was saying the campaign hasn't started. A lot of times people don't really start paying attention till Labor Day. That's not a great argument that we're just going to keep coasting in this losing position and hope that things turn around on their own in September. It's just not a good argument for turning things around. And it's also not an acknowledgement that things do need to be turned around if he's going to win.
All right. We have the news from Jim Himes, which did seem to me, I guess if I'm reading the meta message of Himes coming out, Basil, it doesn't feel accidental, right? Like to do it right after that press conference, in which I don't think that was like a disqualifying press conference in any way. I don't think anyone would think that, like, oh my God, that was a disaster. No one's walking away from that press conference feeling the way they might have after that debate. To come out after that press conference and say, I still think he's been a heroic leader, he's great, and he needs to step aside, to me seems to indicate some coordinated effort.
Yeah.
Was pre-written?
Yes.
Ready for NATO?
Yes, I don't think I don't think he just drew it up in that hour. What do you think?
Right. No, I do think there might be some, because there's been so much happening and there's a constant drip that people feel compelled to continue to sort of do something and say something because it's been happening over the last 2 weeks. But if you look at the Joe Biden of today, he could sit in a rocking chair and have the same answers to those same questions and be like, you know what, this guy's actually fairly conversant on public policy. We are not quibbling about whether or not he's good on policy. So what are we quibbling about? We're concerned about the fact that after a debate that he called for, where the stakes are really high, where we wanted him to really go after Donald Trump, he didn't do it the way we wanted him to. And you know what? That's unfortunate. And that's
unfortunate. That's understating the
No. Because the issues with Joe Biden for many voters are built in. But we wanted to see him on that debate stage really take it to a guy who, Project 2025, he's pretty much embraced. And he didn't do that. And you know what? I get that. But at the same time, we know that Joe Biden is very good on public policy. We know he's very good on the issues. And if we think about the politics of this, I get that there are a lot of candidates down ballot. Chuck Schumer especially does not want to lose the Senate. Nobody wants to lose the Senate. He clearly does not want to lose the Senate and is very concerned about that. You got Hakeem in New York, where getting the majority back for Democrats runs through New York largely, and I'm sure he's hearing from his members. I get all of that. But my point is, you tell this Joe Biden that he's got to step down, and he'll tell you, I have 3,896 delegates. Take them from me.
Right now.
I mean, he sort of said that. Like, kind of said that tonight because he said he would.
But my point is that, we're here because there are a lot of people right after the debate that started wringing their hands and saying, I don't know, this isn't the guy for me. But
I don't think that's why we're here. I worked for Joe Biden. I love Joe Biden. And I just have to say, the problem with the debate is that it reaffirmed what a lot of people feared, was that he was old. He is 81 years old. He is very conversant on policy. This is not a question of whether he is good on policy, whether he's been an effective president, or whether he is a good man. He is all of those things.
Or whether he has more expertise than Donald Trump, or is better on policy.
Who is promising to flip his allegiances on the Ukraine war. It's about whether he can defeat Donald Trump. And the challenge is with that press conference, which he was quite conversant on all these issues, it didn't give people a path, nor was it maybe designed to, on how he could defeat Trump in November. So I think it gave them, it gave them more time, which for the campaign is a win, right?
They want.
It doesn't mean it's a win for the process, because this purgatory and this in-between is a real challenge, and the uncertainty is what's a challenge for the down-ballot candidates. One of the things that's
I actually absolutely agree with you. This is a purgatory. This is a terrible, terrible moment. We cannot have another week of this, because we're done. We're lost. We're done. It's insurmountable. We have another.
I disagree.
But no, I think it's insurmountable if we have another week like this. Absolutely. And I want this to not be the case. But if we have another week, we're done. Period. So my feeling is, and I absolutely agree with you, that this hand-wringing, this outward sort of conversation about whether or not he's fit for office has created the situation that we're in. But my issue is...
Oh, that's not what I said, though.
No, I get it.
Oh, no, okay.
But just to be clear, wait, I
think the debate is about something different.
Sorry, I'm hosting a show, so let me just say this. The hand-wringing has partly created it, but we just got to be clear here. The debate precipitated all of this. The debate, we would not be sitting here. We wouldn't be having this. The but-for cause of the last few weeks is a debate that the Biden folks asked for because they thought it was an opportunity to claw back on Donald Trump. And the performance there was so unnerving that we're having this conversation. That's what precipitated.
No, and I get that. And that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying.
Right.
He asked for this. Right. He didn't perform the way a lot of folks wanted him to perform, probably not the way he wanted to perform. And here we are. But my issue is this. If you're standing up, if you're a Democrat right now and you're standing up and you're saying that Joe Biden is not fit to run for office and therefore should not be in office in January, you're saying he's also not fit to be president right now. What the hell are you doing? That is what you're saying, because you're telling voters that he does not have the chops to be president for the next 4 years, starting in January. Okay. And I have a huge problem with that.
Okay, well, hold that for a second, because I want to hear what you think.
I actually think a lot of the Democrats who've been out there and a lot of people who've been voicing concern are about whether he can defeat Donald Trump. They're looking at the states, they're looking at their districts, they're looking at concerns about the voters on whether he is up to the job. I have not heard a Democrat say he should, aside from maybe one in Washington state, that he should step down or he is not up to the job now. We're having this conversation because Donald Trump, in part, is not Mitt Romney, right? Donald Trump is an existential threat to our country and our democracy. So it's a question and a debate and a conversation that's important to have, right? Or that's how I feel. And I think a lot of people who are bringing forward questions are being very, very thoughtful about it. It does need to be resolved, and I agree with you on that. The question is,
well, it's got to be resolved. You can't have this for... But let me just want to say one more thing about that, because I actually think there is a logical separation. There are some people who say those are logically connected. If you don't think he can run for office, he can't be the president. What I think the way you logically separate them, if you were to say, write a speech saying why one, not the other, is that what you're asking the voters to is for him to be the president when he's 85, right? Like that is the ask. When people are asked, do you think the president's too old to serve a second term? Because elections, as we know, are about the future. What will the next 4 years buy? You could say, I am, as you saw in that press conference, I just did this NATO thing. I know what I'm doing here. Right. But when I have an honest assessment with my family and friends. I don't know that I could be the person I am now in 4 years. Like, you can say that. I'm not saying that's good. I'm just saying those are logically separate conceptual issues. To your point here, what I think we all agree on, and I think what everyone agrees on, is the indeterminate purgatory cannot continue indefinitely. So some resolution, whether Joe Biden is definitively nominated, this is all knocked down, or something else, is going to happen and happen relatively soon. Jen Psaki and Basil Smikle, thank you both.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn. MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.